Hello everyone, today we're going to do a tier list of all the engines in Kerbal Space Program. I want to explain the concept because you've probably already seen one of these videos before. I will note that I have not included the engines from the DLCs, but other than the RCS engines, I believe I have included every part that produces thrust in the stock game. Unfortunately, as you can probably tell already, about half of the pictures came out weird and you can't see the full part, but I'm too lazy to fix that, so let's just get into it. First, I'll be ranking all of the liquid-fueled engines. And it goes without saying that this is just my opinion. You'll probably have different answers to this. First of all, let's start with the skipper engine. It's kind of like halfway between a vacuum engine and an atmospheric engine. So it's pretty middle of the road. I'm going to go ahead and put it in C for now, just because it seems like a fairly decent engine to put in the C category. Like, it's middle of the road. The higher ones can be higher than that. The lower ones can be lower. Mainsail, I'm going to rank as a B tier, slightly above the skipper. The poodle as well, I actually have two poodles there. I'll just leave the other one. But the poodle I'm also going to put in B tier. Logic is the poodle does its job pretty well as an upper stage, highly efficient vacuum engine, and the mainsail does its job as well, just raw power. With the skipper, yeah, it's a compromise between the two, but it also is kind of worse because it is a compromise. So I'm not going to put it too low. Next, I am going to go with the Thud Engine, and I am going to put that in D tier. I don't have the stats up in front of me, so I could be wrong about this, but it is just so heavy for what it does. I mean, it's great if you need like a little bit of extra thrust early game, or if you're making shuttle replicas, and that's basically it. There's nothing much it does. I mean, if you need like a radial mounted engine, that's like the only high thrust like radial mounted engine that's like all in one. But other than that, I don't see much use for it. Now the dart engine is a weird one, because on paper it's really good, but I don't really use it for much. So part of me wants to put it in D, part of me wants to put it in C, and part of me wants to put it in B. However, just for the simple fact that I don't use it much, I am going to put it in C. I mean, on paper, it has excellent like specific impulse all across the range, but the lack of gimbal really hurts it. It's also really useful. Actually, no, it's really useful if you want like a low profile bottom engine. So again, part of me, I want to put it like as a C plus, if you know what I mean, or a B minus, because like it partially succumbs to the same fate the skipper has. Like, it's a compromise between having a vacuum engine and having a sea level engine. However, because it actually does both jobs well, like I'll look up the numbers. Hold on. Sea level and vacuum specific impulses are 290 and 340, which are actually really high, especially compared to like actually, yeah, this is a solid B tier. It has way more. Honestly, I should probably use it more. It's way better than I thought it would be. It's low profile. It has really high efficiency. Honestly, looking like I was gonna do C, but it's definitely B the closer I look at it, counterintuitively. Vector, solid A. No question about it. It's high thrust. I think it's like the second highest thrust to weight ratio in the game. It's super compact for what it does. It has that massive gimbal range, although you'll probably need to turn that down for most applications. It's one of the few engines that can get you off of Eve, I believe. Yeah, all around it's a really solid engine. It's probably the highest thrust per surface area engine of anything in the game. It's compact, high efficiency, high thrust. It's basically got it all. In career mode, the cost might bite you. For the same reason, I'm going to put the... I don't want A tier to get too crowded, but I think I am also going to put the Mammoth in A tier, because it's basically 4 vectors, although it loses the space advantages. It does beat the Vector in some stats, but like it's the heaviest, it's the most powerful engine in the game, unless you're looking into solid rocket boosters. I'm not sure if the solids beat it completely. Mammoth is definitely below the Vector in my opinion, but they're basically the same engine, just more of them. So, and I don't really have a lot of granularity in there. So now I'm gonna do the Twitch and the Spark. These two are very close. Like the Twitch is a better atmospheric engine, and the Spark is a better vacuum engine, which is worse at atmospheric. I have a hard time ranking these. But actually, I'm gonna hold off on ranking them. I want to put them either both in B or both in C. So I'll just wait on that a little bit. Also, I had 2 darts and 2 poodles, so whatever. LV909 Terrier. That is a solid A tier. Unlike the other 2 early engines that you get, the LVT45 and the LVT30, the Terrier is basically it doesn't like ever get obsolete. Like, you'll always have a use for it. Like, there's no other lightweight vacuum engine that comes close to what the Terrier can do. It is like, what's the specific impulse number? Hold on. It has the third highest vacuum specific impulse of any liquid-fueled engine in the game, and that includes the atomic rocket. If you do not include the atomic rocket, then it has the second highest, which is only beaten by the Poodle, which is 5 seconds higher. Going back to the Thud a bit, like, more rational about why I put it in the D tier, it seems to be trying to be an atmospheric engine, like a first-stage lifter engine, but if we look at it as a first-stage lifter engine, it has the worst thrust-to-weight ratio of any first-stage engine on the entire list, unless you count the Spider as an atmospheric engine. Next up will be the LVT-30 Reliant rocket engine. I am going to put that in the D tier. I considered to put it in the F tier, but I went through the thing I actually recorded earlier, and it ended up not fitting well. So it doesn't have gimbal, its stats are mediocre compared to other engines which are supposed to serve its purpose. Initially, I was going to say it's obsolete basically right after you get it because you'll unlock the swivel right afterwards, but it turns out the Reliant is actually behind the swivel in the tech tree, and there are very, very, very few cases where you would want to use a Reliant over the swivel. It is slightly cheaper, but it's a 100 fund difference. Like, when have you ever needed to scrape 100 funds off of a craft's cost? However, I don't think the swivel is that great of an engine either. It's not, like, bad, though. I'm going to put it in C tier, above the Reliant, definitely above the Thud, of course. Now, granted, I know that the LVT-30 does have a few stats that are above the LVT-45s. However, the lack of gimbal really sets it back. And in fact, I'm actually kind of considering rating the Dart lower because of its lack of gimbal now that I'm counting it so highly against the Reliant. Yeah, I've thought about it. Really, the Dart could go anywhere depending on your personal preferences. I'm going to go ahead and put it in B. Going back to the 2.5 meter parts, I am going to rank the twin bore. I am going to put it in B tier, same as the mainsail. It does have a bit lower specific impulse than the mainsail does, but it makes up for that by having a lot more thrust, which is... It's designed as a booster rocket. The only reason I might consider ranking it lower is that the two bulges on the side make it a bit awkward to use in like large groups sometimes. But at the same time, it is very comparable to taking a Jumbo 64 and sticking it on a mainsail. It has some advantages, some disadvantages. All around, I think it's kind of the same, so I put it on the same tier. So the last big boy liquid-fueled rocket engine I have to rate is the Rhino, and I'm kind of conflicted as to where to put this exactly. It's for where you need high thrust and also reasonably high efficiency, but the thing is, I don't really see much of an area where you would use this and not the Nerve. Because I can't really think of many cases where you would need high thrust in a vacuum unless you were just really impatient. Like, I can understand being too impatient for ion engines, but I can't understand much of being too impatient for nuclear engines. It also doesn't have as high of a specific impulse as the other two main vacuum engines, the Poodle and the Terrier, although it only misses the Terrier by 5 seconds. As such, in my opinion, due to its rather limited use case, I'm going to go ahead and stick it in C tier, although this is definitely debatable. You could put it higher. I don't think it's like on mainsail level as usefulness, but I could definitely see a case for it being in B tier, especially if you were too impatient for nuclear engines. That would chew it up way higher. Speaking of nuclear engines, solid A tier, 800 seconds of specific impulse. You can't argue with that. It is completely and utterly terrible at pretty much everything other than being like a long-range vacuum engine. Like, even using it to land on places, you're gonna run into some problems with its really low thrust-to-weight ratio. It can only do one thing very well, but it does that one thing very, 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 very well, and that's why it's, in my opinion, undisputably A tier. Alright, back to the Twitch and the Spark. So I have decided that I'm going to place them in C tier. They have trade-offs between each other, but they're good probe-sized engines, and there's not really much else I can say about that. Now, the Ant and the Spider, I am both going to put in D tier. I'm not saying they don't have their uses, however, there are very few situations in which I would prefer one of these over one of these. Like, they're basically the same thing, but bigger and smaller. And if I'm not mistaken, the Spider and the Ant have worse specific impulse than the Twitch and the Spark. But as far as each other goes, like, again, you have the compromise between atmospheric radial mounted and vacuum stack mounted. You could have uses for either one, but in my opinion, you would almost never want one of these two over the other two. Now, the Puff monopropellant engine. It took me like 5 takes to say that correctly. Just about the only thing it has going for it is it is the only main engine in the game that can use monomer propellant as a fuel source. However, that does not matter very often, and its stats are utterly trash, so I'm going to put it in the D tier. The only thing saving it from the F tier is that, as I said earlier, it's the only monopropellant engine in the game. Out of every single engine in the game, it has the worst vacuum-specific impulse at 250. Now, some solids might be lower, I haven't checked those yet. And it has the 4th worst sea-level specific impulse in the game as well. The atomic engine has a higher sea-level specific impulse than the puff. That's how bad it is. Really, if you are considering using the puff at all, please just use the twitch instead. It is better in basically every category. I'll say it again, the only thing saving this from the F tier is the fact that if you really need a monopropellant engine, this is the only one for you, unless you cluster a bunch of RCS ports. Okay, I believe that's all of the specifically liquid-fueled engines. I accidentally duplicated the Dart and Poodle. That's why they're there, and I'm going to save the Rapier for later. So now I'm going to do the jet engines. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the Weasley. I'm going to go ahead and put the Weasley in B tier, for the simple reason that it's a very solid 1.25 meter jet engine. It fills its role very well. It also has that nice thrust reverser. I don't have much else to say about that. Now the Juno engine, I am going to put in C tier. It is a bit worse than stats like. Granted, it's the only 0.625 meter jet engine, so it has that going for it. Like it is really close to being a B tier engine. It's not a bad engine by any means. It's just worse than the Weasley. It does not have thrust reversers, and its efficiency is also significantly worse. However, again, it's not a bad engine by any means. The Whiplash is also a solid B tier. It's a really good engine, super high thrust and the supersonic, and even it's a amazing engine for single-stage orbit spaceplanes. The Goliath engine, I am kind of conflicted. Just because I don't use it that much, I might just put it in C tier. But that shouldn't, I don't know. It's another CB engine like the Juno. It does have the highest specific impulse of any jet engine in the game, and I believe that makes it have the highest specific impulse in the entire game overall. So if you want a long-range efficient aircraft as your choice, it's the only jet engine to have an integrated intake. It also has the highest subsonic thrust of any engine in the game, I believe. So that makes it really great for big airplanes. In short, it does its job really well, but you're not going to need to do that job very much. If the game placed a lot more emphasis on atmospheric flight, this would definitely be a B tier engine. However, most people just won't use it often. Now the Panther I am also going to place in C tier. In my opinion, it is probably the... Okay. It is the engine I probably use least in... It is the jet engine I probably use the least. And in my opinion, this is definitely arguable. It's probably the worst jet engine in the game. However, none of the jet engines in the game are actually that bad, so it's not like the worst, it's just the least good, in my opinion. It obviously has 2 modes. It can basically switch from being a worse Weasley to being a worse Whiplash, but at the extra benefit of having a ton of gimbal. So the only 2 things I can really see it being used for are fighter jets, where you need that extra burst of maneuverability, and mid-game single-staged orbit spaceplanes where you don't have the Whiplash unlocked yet, but you still want to make an SSTO, even though it won't carry much. This is definitely the best engine for fighter jets, but even then, you'll probably be using it less often than you will be using the Goliath. Now the Rapier, you could make an argument for B tier, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in the A tier. It is an amazing engine for single-staged orbit spaceplanes, as it can switch between being a jet engine and being a rocket engine. Now, I will admit its performance as a rocket engine is pretty mediocre at best, but as a jet engine, I forget which one's maximum speed is higher, but in many cases it is on par with or better than the Whiplash, while only being 200 kilograms heavier. So basically, it's unbeatable for spaceplanes, and that's not really disputable. Even though it's mediocre in rocket mode, just being able to have a rocket engine and a jet engine in a very small space with not much extra mass is an amazing feature to be able to have on spaceplane. So basically, yeah, Rapier, really good. Now, the Ion Engine. You could definitely make an argument for this. There are going to be people out there that swear it's A tier, and there are going to be people out there that swear it's F tier. I am going to put it in B tier. Now obviously it has the highest specific impulse in the game by far at a whopping 4,200 seconds. However, its thrust output is awful and it uses up a lot of electricity. But thrust doesn't matter too much if you're using it as a vacuum engine. The tiny thrust, however, does incur a massive penalty in the real world. Whenever you're going to do a maneuver with the ion engine, you're going to need to wait a long time for that burn to complete, and in many cases you'll need to split it up over multiple orbits to get the maneuver done. And that real world time cost is why a lot of people just don't use it and swear it's F tier, but the people who are really patient will put it in A tier. Another big disadvantage with the ion engine is that really you can't use it very far out into the solar system unless you bring a ridiculous amount of solar panels or are willing to wait for your batteries to recharge frequently. Because really the only practical way to power it is to use large solar panels. And of course the sun gets less powerful the further away you get from the sun. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Let's move on to the solid rocket boosters. As you can tell, most of the icons got destroyed when I converted them and had the program automatically resize them. So I'm just going to go in order that they are on the wiki. The RT5 flea, which is that even in here? Okay, so it looks like I accidentally forgot to get the flea. But if the flea was here, I would put it in F tier. Because really, in a career mode setting, you're only going to use the flea once for your very first launch to just hop off the pad and into the air to get some science. You might use it very sparingly after that, like as an early first stage booster rocket, but there's nothing that the flea does that the hammer doesn't do better. To signify that it's there, I'm going to put my duplicate Poodle and Toroidal Aerospike in the F tier. Don't mistake that as them being in the F tier. Now the hammer booster, it's not much better. I'm going to put it in D tier. Again, much like the flea booster, you're not going to see much use out of it besides early career mode. It doesn't really have much late game utility to it. It also seems that I've forgotten the Mite solid rocket booster, which is the really small 0.625 meter one. That will also go in F tier. For its size, its stats are far better than the flea. However, I cannot think of a single use case, besides maybe using it in a missile. I mean, I could maybe see using it as a probe kick stage, but that's basically the only thing. And some liquid fuel tanks and a spark would probably do the job better. So that's why I'm putting it in F tier. Now the shrimp, I'm pretty sure this one is the shrimp, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to put that in D. It's more useful than the Mite and flea. However, I don't see much utility of using it outside, like strapping it to the first stage of the booster. Which, I'll admit, it does look really nice in that role, like if you want to like build a Delta II replica or something. I'm going to put the BACC Thumper in B tier. Now that is definitely disputable. The Thumper stats are pretty bad compared to like some of the bigger solid rocket boosters. However, I put it in B tier simply because it'll work great with 1.25 meter rockets and it'll also work great with 2.5 meter rockets. I can't tell very well, but I believe this one is supposed to be the Kickback. I'm going to put the Kickback in C tier. Now don't get me wrong, the Kickback has stats far better than the Thumper in almost every area. The reason I rank it lower is because it doesn't go well with a lot of builds. Now back before we had the Thoroughbred and the Clydesdale, that wouldn't really be the case. The Kickback doesn't work well with 1.25 meter rockets because it's just so tall that like oftentimes it'll be just as tall as the central stack itself, if not taller, unless you have a ridiculously tall 1.25 meter rocket, or you use it at the first stage. It also doesn't work that well with 2.5 meter rockets. Now, don't get me wrong, it works fine-ish, I'd say, but with the most recent updates, we now have the Thoroughbred and the Clydesdale, which are much better suited for the role of boosting 2.5 meter and 3.75 meter rockets. Now, in the updates before the Thoroughbred and the Clydesdale were added, that would definitely be a B tier booster. Now, the Thoroughbred and the Clydesdale, which I believe are this one and this one, well, I could be wrong, that icon could literally be anything, it's just a metal box. I will admit I have not used them much. I have not played very much Kerbal Space Program over the past year due to attending university, and when I have played it, I've usually not played the most updated vanilla version. As such, I have not used the Thoroughbred and Clydesdale solid rocket boosters very much. However, just looking at their stats and with what experience I have had with them, I am going to put them both in B tier because I think they would work around the same effectiveness as the Thumper, if not more. But then again, that is probably not the most accurate assessment as I have not had time to use them much. Now, the last engine I have here is the Separatron, assuming I haven't forgotten any more. Now, on one hand, it has the absolute worst specific impulse of any of the solid rocket boosters, both atmospheric and vacuum. It also has the second lowest thrust of any solid rocket booster in the game after the Might. So if you are looking at it from a pure, normal rocket standpoint, it is an utterly terrible engine. However, as the name implies, it is the only engine in the game designed for separating boosters or stages away from anything. If you've played Kerbal Space Program for any amount of time, you've probably had one of these guys save your rocket. We've all had that feeling of trying to get away without using Separatrons, and then having our rocket explode at booster separation and having to revert to add them. They are also super compact and fun to play around with. If you haven't strapped 200 Separatrons to a rover to see how fast it would go, have you really truly played Kerbal Space Program? And for those reasons, I must put the Separatron in A tier. It's a really fun engine that just saved countless spacecraft. Now granted, these are definitely debatable, and I've made no secret of that throughout the video, and your rankings may definitely be different. In the future, I might do a ranking with all the DLC engines, but I'd also be open to other ideas. Let me know if there's anything else in Kerbal Space Program that could be ranked this way. And just a reminder, if you skip to the end of the video to see the ranking, these are duplicate engines, I just stuck them here. These represent the Might and Flea solid rocket boosters. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye!